Hey everybody, Woj here, Vectra Product Marketing. Welcome to the Hunt Club podcast. This is the product briefing show, and I brought a guest on with me this time, Martin Baker. He and I remember Martin. We talked probably months ago about having you on the podcast. My bad, I didn't follow through on bringing you on. And we were at Hunt Club um, conference last week. Was
Yep,
it last
last week.
week? Wow,
Yep.
in Berlin, and we just riffed on a bunch of cool topics to talk about. Martin, why don't you introduce yourself so our viewers know who you are, what you do, why you're here.
Yeah. So for those that don't know me, my name's Martin Baker. I'm one of the security consulting analyst engineers within the Vectra team. I've been at Vectra for over 4 years now. I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. And one of the things I want to do during these podcasts is kind of like convey some of the best uses, best practices actually of using the Vectra platform, and kind of like just ensure that everyone's using the platform to its best of its ability.
Awesome. Hence the reason why you're in the product briefings show. You'll see Martin's face and hear his voice, and we might pull up some slideware and some demo stuff from time to time. But make sure you subscribe if you like what Martin and I are talking about. There'll be more of it. Subscribe, like, comment, give us ideas, pose questions, topics that you'd love to hear Martin's perspective on, and we'll queue them up as future episodes. But this first go round, Martin, we talked about a lot of stuff at Hunt Club. And this first one, the first topic we kind of landed on to talk about was this notion of event detection versus entity prioritization. And, you know, at its core, like why talk about that? Like what's at the crux of kind of this conversation? Entities versus events.
Yeah, so this comes up quite often about obviously alternative or different security tools, etc. Now, Vectra works on prioritization of entities. Now, the question being, why should we concentrate, on entities, rather than detections? Is that it's more about if you think of an incident, we've got an incident, that's happened, a host has been, compromised, or something suspicious has happened. Now, looking at the term an incident, we've got to kind of think of an incident is made up of multiple events. So if we think that an event is a detection, but we've got an incident that's a prioritized host, so a host that's got some scoring on it. We've been told, through our scene platform or whatever tool it may be, you need to look at this because there's something strange that's happening. Now, if we think that an incident made up of multiple events with the platform scoring in Vectra, we've got a host, for example, that's got 3 or 4 detections. That's likely going to have a high prioritization scoring based on the platform, how the actual scoring works within it, the different detection types, the different detection categories. Now, that's not to say that even if we have an individual host that has a single detection for maybe botnet monetization, outbound port sweep, cryptocurrency mining, these hosts are all going to automatically be prioritized to actually tell you that you need to look at this one. Whereas if we look at, maybe a host has just done a port scan, or a port sweep because it's looking for, any hosts that have got port 9100 open, that's looking for likely, a HP printer. Now, it doesn't mean, that that host has been compromised. It just means that that host is looking for a HP printer that it
Hmm.
normally connects to. So looking at the actual individual detections themselves, it can be kind of a long thing, actually looking in a platform. Now, I've got behind your screen that I'm looking at now on a demo platform. I've got 127 detections actually on the demo platform. But looking at the actual number of prioritized entities, we've actually only got 4. So if you were to break up that there is probably a large number of hosts on here, quite possibly, we might have, maybe 12 or 20 detections over those prioritized ones, and the rest of those entities may just be single hosts with single detections on them. So it's always worth bearing in mind that an incident is made up of multiple events. Okay, an incident is a prioritized entity. Okay, and an event is a single detection. So that's one of the things that I really want to convey to everyone, just to ensure that using the platform for prioritization over single event detection, is the way forward and the way that the platform should be used. That was a
And
long answer to a,
no,
a
no,
very, very short question.
no, no. Well, I mean, I'm sure you're gonna show us what this looks like. We can see it in the background. I love your background, by the way. Who's the guy sitting on top of your head
Oh,
coming
that's
out of this?
the old logo. I'll probably get told off for having that, which is why I'll cover it. But you'll
No,
notice
that's
that my
fine.
dashboards never
I
change.
like I like nostalgia. I like nostalgia. So, in terms of like, talk to me. You'd said a couple things. Talk to me a little bit about um what that means relative. We talk a lot about alerts versus signal, right? Detection versus prioritization. Talk to me about the impact that has on, you hear terms like fidelity, signal fidelity, and benign versus malicious, false positive, and benign, versus malicious alerts, etc. In the real world, like when you're stitching together, and I'm assuming you're stitching together events detected, right? That's basically what it's doing,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
correlating it to a host and then prioritizing that host. What does that mean from an alert fidelity or signal fidelity perspective? How accurate
So
is this? Is this an accuracy thing? Is this a
well, it can be defined sometimes, if somebody was to say, this is low fidelity because, we've got a host, for example, that's done a port sweep, and not forgetting as well, when we talk about entities, these are hosts and accounts.
Mhm.
For simplicity, I will talk more about hosts because there's a lot more people that can relate to, hosts per se. But when we've got a host, some people may say, this is low fidelity. There's a port sweep or a port scan. Again, using the example of looking for port 9100, and it's like, okay, so why is this a threat? And again, this may not be perceived as a threat, but it's the actions that happen after that reconnaissance activity has taken place. If an attacker was to compromise a host, they're going to want to look for hosts that they can compromise, and move laterally around the network. So actually looking at, false positives, you know, the term false positive with Vectra, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, because when an event has happened, a host has, exfiltrated some data. It may be going to SharePoint, but it's not actually a false positive because that event has actually happened.
right?
So that could be defined as a benign true positive because it's a true positive because they did exfiltrate data to SharePoint, but it's actually benign because it's a known corporate domain that it's going to.
Right.
When we start looking at malicious true positives, these are things where we've either got a prioritized entity that's got maybe 3, 4, 5, or 6 detections on them, or an individual detection maybe for Tor or outbound port sweep. These are the ones that, again, we should be concentrating on these more. But once we've actually identified things like, these malicious true positives, it's not just staying there looking at those. It's actually looking at the other, indicators of compromise that we've actually observed, whether going through the investigate function within the respond UX, or even looking at recall, or stream to look for additional indicators because, you know, every detection, tells a different story.
Hmm.
Every incident is going to have different events. It's going to have different hosts. It's going to have different accounts. So we can't just say that, an event will look like A, B, and C. It could be A, B, D, E, and F as an example. So we always need to look at, the bigger picture about what and how things are actually happening, and the broader picture on our network in general.
Yeah, you painted a you painted a picture for me in terms of like, and maybe you'll pull this up in kind of a demo and kind of show it, but when an event is, or when you have a detection, you might look at an individual detection and say, oh, this is nothing. You might triage it out, right? Oh, this is nothing. Not knowing that another detection is related to that detection. Explain, walk me through that example again, from like an analyst experience perspective.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'm just going to load up I'm just going to load up a couple of pages now. Um, One of the things that those listening to this podcast now or know that whenever I do a demo, obviously I do some preparation, but I like to go into things very, very blind. The reason I do is because as an analyst, you don't get to pick the things that you do in your day-to-day workplace.
Mm.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of go in blind with this now, but I'm just going to share the screen. Um, Now, this is a demo environment that we're using, so it is a bit synthetic what we're looking at here. There's one thing that I will be doing, and please remind me after this, Mark, to actually change some things on here. Undo what I've done because otherwise, some of the TME team they actually tell me off. So hopefully, I didn't ask. Hopefully, you can see the screen at the
Yeah.
moment. You can see
Yep.
that okay. Okay. So we've got on here, like I said earlier, we've got 127 detections over our accounts and also our hosts. So these are, both types of entities. Now, for a normal kind of analyst, like I said, you would normally be working from the hunt view or you'd be working from the respond view. So really should be looking at anything. And in this case, we've got our 17 prioritized entities broken up into accounts and hosts, like I said. Now, those 127 detections aren't necessarily over these 17 prioritized entities, because looking at the hunt page on here, we can actually see that we've got a total of 56 entities, okay, that are active or have detections that are on them. Okay, so we've got 39 that are not prioritized. Okay, so looking at these 17 that are prioritized, these are the ones that we should be focused on. Now, looking at the detections as an example, and this is where things can go a little bit wrong sometimes if we were to start doing things in the wrong order. Now, on here, for example, I'm just going to pick a random one here where we've got this Buckley PC. So looking at individual detections on Buckley PC here, we've got a suspicious remote execution. So we're going to look at this individual detection itself. Okay. Again, I don't know what the status actually of this particular host is. Now, depending on when you've actually looked at this individual detection and not being entity centric, so this is looking at things detection centric now. You may look at this and then say, right, okay, well, we've got a service control manager as the UUID going over to this host here. Is this abnormal? Is this normal? You may observe that there's an account on here. You may come to the conclusion and say, okay, this is benign activity because we've got some, updates or whatever it is happening on the network. So you may go in here and filter just this detection. In this case, I'm going to mark as fixed just for time constraints. So this has removed the scoring now for this individual detection. And now what it's done is it's applied it to the entity. Okay,
Mm.
so if we now go over to the entity here, because I was looking at the individual detection itself, okay, and we can see that this is fixed. This particular entity, okay, has got a total of 10 detections, which we have actually done one on. Now, again, the reason why we should be looking at entities itself and not individual detections is because, again, this is something I haven't seen. I've not prepped this, but we can see on the 6th of April, a 0423, something happened, suspicious remote execution. Same timing on the 7th, the same timing on the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th. Well, this probably looks like some kind of scheduled task that's happening on this particular host. So actually, we only need to technically look at one of these detections, okay, and maybe look at another one, to kind of get a bit of a pattern of life, as to
Mm-hmm.
what's happening. So instead of us looking at, all five of these suspicious remote execution detections, actually we only need to look at one, and the same with the suspicious LDAP query. Now, given that this LDAP query happens around the same time as the remote execution, this could be, again, a scheduled task. This could be anything, that's either benign, or this could be some malware that's, triggered to go off at 0423 every day. Okay, but in this case, we've technically, reduced our workload, by 80% here by just looking at the individual entity and looking at the correlation between all of these other detections that are on here. Okay, so again, that could save us, 5, 10, 15 minutes, or maybe even an hour, and then ensuring as well. This, what I marked here as fixed, this is actually, a brilliant example I've picked, because if this is benign activity and it's expected, okay, we've got something that's happening day after day after day after day. So instead of an analyst coming in here every single day, marking as fixed or filter just this detection, okay, why don't we just create a triage filter for this? And then that way this entity won't be prioritized. In this case, this isn't prioritized, but we'll just pretend it is. But in this case, we don't need to just keep on repeating ourselves
Yeah.
day after day after day, looking at the same thing. And again, that comes in with actually looking at the entities and looking at the, the correlation of the events that have happened. And also, if this is happening on this PC, could this also be happening on one of some of the other PCs as well? So not saying never ever look at individual detections, but if you were to actually think how many suspicious remote execution detections have we got? We've got 60 across the board. Okay. Now we've identified, that 5 of those 60 are from the same host. Are we seeing things on other hosts as well? So again, it's not necessarily ruling out individual detection, being detection centric, but it's actually finding the correlation of all of these detections that have triggered on an entity to kind of like tell us, you should be looking at this.
Yeah. We talk about like what's one thing that attackers love and kind of thrive in, and it's latency, right? And it's like, how do we often say, and when, as you were talking about this, instead of going in and looking at each and every single one and like look at it holistically, like how much latency does this remove in a defender's kind of workflow, taking that entity centric approach, because the shorter time span you give an attacker, the less likely they are to progress their attack, execute their campaign, whatever you want to call it. Awesome. Like
Yeah,
what? Go. Sorry, go ahead, Martin.
I was going to say that there's one more thing as well to kind of like put on this, and I've seen this, I wouldn't say multiple times, but I have seen instances where being detection centric can kind of like bite you, kind of like very bad. Now there's all being proactive, so we'll say that a detection for port sweep has come in at 12 o'clock midday. We'll use some timings like that. The analyst then gets alerted through their SIEM or through, they look and they see a port sweep detections coming. I keep using that port sweep, but it is nice and easy. Port sweep detection comes in at 12 o'clock. Analyst then looks at it 10 minutes later and says, well, it's looking for port 22, or, 389 or whatever the port number may be. Looks at it and then closes that individual detection out because they think
Yeah.
it's benign, because it is benign, okay,
Mhm.
in that instance. Then at 12:15 or 12:30, you then get another detection come in for maybe internal darknet scan or maybe some lateral movement. Okay, so the analyst then looks at the individual detection and then says, well, that's benign, closes that individual detection out. Then maybe at 1300, a detection comes in for exfil. And they look at it and then they say, well, that's going out to, a cloud service provider. And it's like, well, that's benign. And then they close it. In reality, that particular entity should be, because we've got lateral movement, we've got recon, and we've got exfiltration. That entity should actually be prioritized, and that'll have a high prioritization scoring. But what's kind of happened is you've looked at the recon and you've said, nope, go back down. Then you've looked at the lateral, it's come up, and then you've said, that's benign, go back down. Then you've looked at the exfil, go back down, when in actual fact, what should have happened was no scoring, recon, then further scoring for lateral, and then further scoring for
Mhm.
exfiltration. So actually, you've kind of like, it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole a little bit too early, because,
Yeah.
that entity should have been all the way up here, but you've kind of like individually looked at the individual detections and not looked at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So
And that,
can't emphasize that one enough.
like, how big of a, I mean, shifting from this detection mindset or workflow to an entity centric workflow, how big of a change management? It doesn't sound like it's a giant change in workflow. It's just less, it's letting the system do the correlation, the stitching, and putting the pieces together. The analyst is still doing the same thing the analyst does. They just have more context and information at their fingertips. We often get, I think I've ranted before about this, the industry's infatuation with detections. Thou must detect give me every possible detection. Well, your analyst can't look at every possible detection, and you can't look at them in a silo and individually, because you don't get the complete picture. So I love this conversation. Like, we could foray this into so many other things, but let's end this podcast on, like you started it off with like hey, I want our customers and people that use the Vectra AI platform to glean the most value out of it. Use it as it's intended to be used in order to glean the most value out of it. And that is entity prioritization, not necessarily detections. For those that don't embrace entity, I mean, is this a huge change management issue? Is this a huge, like, how do you get people to kind of embrace the prioritization, entity prioritization kind of mindset?
Obviously, every customer, to apologize, every customer is different. Each customer will have different SOAR platforms. They have different EDR solutions, lots and lots of things. You know, there may be, depending on the customer or the current customers, the mindset of what they do and things. This may just be a graceful change.
Yeah,
Whereas this could involve maybe, and it's not going to be massive engineering efforts, but it could just be rewriting, certain rules in the SOAR, whether it's
yeah,
Sentinel, whatever it may be, to actually pull from the different API endpoints, which we do have another podcast coming up for API, pulling the different API endpoints in, so we can actually, or the platform can actually prioritize again based on the entities and not the individual
yeah,
detections. And
yep,
this is more based on the scoring as well, but more importantly the prioritization of the host. So not necessarily massive engineering efforts, per se, but again, pulling the information via the API, using the API, to actually pull the information required, to pull the prioritized entities, to put it into the analyst workflow.
yeah, yeah. Awesome. It's all about signal. It's always
Yep,
been about signal,
indeed, and using
right?
it properly. Yep,
Exactly. Martin, thank you.
no
This will be
problem at
one
all.
of many. This will be one of
Yep,
many. Okay, everyone get used to seeing Martin, hearing Martin, because he's going to share some really cool stuff. As he had alluded to, we've got a few queued up. Like we're going to do one on threat feeds. We're going to do one on metadata. We're going to do one on the API, as he had mentioned, investigations. So we have a lot of cool stuff coming from Martin. Martin, thank you. We'll see you on the next one. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment. I'm Woj. Martin, thank you. We'll
thank
see
you
you
very
on the
much,
next
everyone,
one. All right.
and I'll speak to you all soon. Cheers, Mark.
Take care.
Bye bye. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.